On today's episode, we're going to squeeze 1,400 years of music history into about 30 minutes. Hello, and welcome to the Musician Toolkit episode number 66. My name is David Lane, and it is great to be with you once again. I hope all of you are doing well today. I want to thank you all for checking out the Musician Toolkit once again. I'm recording this introduction to this episode just a few days before its release, and it is a beautiful taste of spring day in North Carolina. Very sunny, and many of our trees that bloom in the spring are already blooming. Could probably argue that all of this is happening a little bit too early, but for right now, I don't plan to complain. So this is an episode today that I would say, if you've studied music history at all, you can probably check out on this episode. This is one for music students, who are studying, but you're studying a primary instrument, and maybe you're trying to learn about some of the other aspects of music. So I wanted to just give a basic overview of music history, because music history, a knowledge of music history, is one of the core tools of being a musician. And I do think that this goes beyond what most people do. I'm going to talk about kind of traditional Western culture, classical music history, which, really primarily talks about Europe and North America, basically. So there's a whole lot that I'm not covering today that deserves to be covered. I'm also not really getting into any other genre. I'm not getting into jazz. I'm not getting into rock. I think the more history you know of any kind of music, the better. But a lot of people in this podcast are striving to be good or better classical musicians. So I thought now would be a good time to at least go over just some basics, because I'm very soon going to be releasing, it's probably not the next episode. The next episode probably has a guest, but the next time I do a solo episode, it's going to be a sequel to one that was very popular that I did last year. I did an episode called 25 Essential Classical Pieces That Everybody Should Know. And so I'm going to have a sequel to that. I'll say more about that when that episode comes out. But I'll be using things like Baroque and classical, Romantic. So I want to go over this, and let me go ahead and be clear. I am really only going to talk up to about the year 1900, and I'll talk a little bit about after 1900 when I get there, and I'll explain why I'm not really willing to go into this episode. But I just want to give you an overview, very basic overview of some of the other periods of music. So the first thing that we really say is we say medieval or Middle Ages. And by the way, all of these dates, so I'm going to say this is roughly 500 to about 1400. These dates are very loose. Like, it's not like the year 1400 came and people said the medieval period's over. It was later before they even had a name for it. In fact, I think I heard recently, like, what we call the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. That's a name that came out in like the 19th century for what we called that. I mean, it's really hundreds of years after the fact that we named that. Now, it wasn't hundreds of years, but it was maybe, dozens of years after the fact when we named some of these things. So what you need to know about the medieval is that it was dominated by the Catholic Church. So most of the music that was put into the form of sheet music was vocal. And much like how the Catholic Church did not change for about 900 years, neither did music. You can find music from 1400 and compare it to that from 1100. And, you really have to take a fine-tooth comb to be able to tell the difference. So some of the examples of famous examples we have of this music are like Gregorian chants. There's also composers like Hildegard von Bingen. I do think there's some ironic justice that music from this time period, most famous composer, is a woman. So instrumental music existed back then, but it's one of those, they're almost more of a novelty to be even played today. So really, when it comes to our classical tradition, it really begins fully with the Renaissance era, which some people say starts at 1400. Others I've read say it starts around 1450. It's probably a little bit more accurate to put it around 1450, and it goes to about 1600. And if you think about what's going on during this time, we're talking about the Protestant Reformation, and of course we're talking about the artistic Renaissance, artistic development. Started in Italy, and then it spread to other European kingdoms, other European states. This is also the time when you start to get colonialism. And the thing to know about music history is that it's always kind of a reflection of world events, things that are going on. Music doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's inspired by and sometimes a response to what is going on. So for Renaissance, you now have not just the Catholic, you have the Protestant church. And you have all across Europe more emphasis on choral music and choral music development. You also have more secular music, you have more instrumental music. The only instrumentalists that typically have written down sheet music that they don't have to arrange very much so they can play today are guitarists. And they didn't have guitar back then, but they had the lute. And the lute music translates well for the guitar. So with very little bit of arranging, you can take a classical guitar and play lute music. So you've got, some composers like John Dowland who did music for lute along with some other composers. You also have a lot of instrumental music in groups that is not super specific. So you'll get instrumental music that has 4 parts, 6 parts, 8 parts. But it doesn't say like this has to be a piccolo or this has to be a B-flat clarinet. I mean, some of those instruments did not exist. So Renaissance music, typically as an instrumentalist, was everybody show up and let's see what we have and let's assign you to part 1 and you to part 2 and you to part 3. So you'll never hear identical recordings of true Renaissance instrumental music. Now, one kind of notable exception to that is the composer Giovanni Gabrieli, who wrote quite a bit of music that was intended for brass instruments. Now, again, how that's divided kind of depends on the director. One thing you want to know about Renaissance music: it was composed during a time where it was dominated by the ecclesiastical modes, your Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, and yes, Locrian exists, but nobody would have composed in that because nobody wanted the tritone, and that is what you get from 1 to 5 on the scale degrees. So this is kind of the dominant, and it has to do with the fact that your instruments back then were not chromatic. Now, tonality starts to take a shift. You start to get more chromatic. You start to get kind of the first semblance of what we would call a major-minor system by the end, but we're still mostly modal in this time period. What I think is really neat is you get some harmonies that are perfectly acceptable 1900 or later. So 20 or 21st century, you can use these Renaissance harmonies and they sound perfectly modern, but they would have been anachronistic between the year 1600 and the late 1800s. And your composers include arguably the greatest of the time period, Josquin des Prez, Giovanni Palestrina, William Byrd, Thomas Tallis, who's very interesting because he composed for the Catholic Queen Mary and the Protestant Queen Elizabeth, and he composed during a time where polyphony was embraced, and then another time where polyphony was discouraged because it was thought that it took away from the text. And he was equally at home in both types of music. If you want an example of a composer who knew how to go with the flow and be successful for a fairly long life during that time period, and lived to be about nearly 80 years old, sorry, I don't have his dates in front of me. He might have been 70 years old, but he lived a long time for back then, and had a great career. Thomas Tallis. Also consider listening to Orlando di Lasso, John Tavener, as I mentioned before, Giovanni Gabrieli, a really wild composer from the time, and especially a wild life, named Carlo Gesualdo, who among the many things that he's known for is apparently catching his wife with another man and killing both of them. So that would be it's a great Hollywood screenplay waiting to be made if you're of that type. And then one more composer, Johannes Akagam. If you play an instrument where a lot of your music that you play begins, your oldest music, is the Baroque era. So the Baroque era is, again, roughly 1600 to 1750. And so much happens in this time. This is where you get the full development of what we call the major-minor system. It's also where we get the full development of basically our modern intonation system. It's not exactly the same, but it's pretty close. And we called it back then well-tempered. This is the time where instruments really get developed. The modern instruments that we play, most of them were invented in their earliest forms during the Baroque era. Kind of one of the exceptions of that is the piano, but we had the clavier, we had the harpsichord, we had the clavichord, so we had things like it that pianists can play. We had the invention of the orchestra. This is where your first orchestra pieces come from. This is where we have specific instrumentation. Now, I have never verified this, but I've heard that the composer Claudio Monteverdi, who is known as the grandfather of the orchestra, he is one of the first to say, I want flutes to play this line. I want violins to play this line. I don't know if that's true, so if you know that it's not true, I am welcome to sending me a message to correct me on that. But that is what I've heard. But whoever is responsible, this is when it becomes commonplace to now label who is doing what in your instrumental music. This is where you had a continued development of polyphony. That's something I didn't really mention in the Renaissance era. Polyphony became very important. And polyphony, again, if you haven't caught my episode on music theory terms, this is independent lines of rhythm working in harmony, where everyone does not have the same rhythm. Other things that are very important, ornamentation. If you perform Baroque work, you have to study how the ornaments worked back then. But also improvisation. It was perfectly fine to add ornaments. It was also perfectly fine to kind of add some additional notes, especially on the repeats. When you do any kind of a Baroque piece with a repeat, you are given license to add your own touch, but hopefully in a way that stylistically makes sense to those variations. Some common structures included dance suite music, which includes pieces with titles such as courant, bourrée, sarabande, minuet, gavotte, gigue. They all have kind of their own identity in terms of rhythms and in terms of structures. You had a lot of binary structures, which is basically A-B forms. Not a lot of ternary back then. Also, polyphonic structures such as fugues and inventions. And you have a lot of pieces called sonatas, but they're not the sonatas that we know from the classical era on. Basically, sonata means a piece to be played, and they tended to be kind of generic instrumental structures in two halves, where you repeat each half. Opera becomes very important, especially Italian first, but also in other nations as well. And you have a lot of large-scale choral works such as cantatas, passions, and oratorios. One thing that I find very noteworthy is, again, we consider the Baroque era to be from roughly 1600 to 1750. Now, 1750 is not an accident. That is the death of J.S. Bach. And it's not that he died at the time and it was such a momentous event the Baroque era is done. It was later, looking back, where the importance of Bach was so profoundly acknowledged that the date of his death was marked as the end of the Baroque era. But what I find really noteworthy is that most of the pieces that we play to this day came from the last 50 years of that period. It's 1700 onward where a lot of this music that we still know is played. All the music that you play from Bach, from Handel, from Henry Purcell, from Antonio Vivaldi, from Domenico Scarlatti, it's all coming after 1700. So now, besides the composers I just mentioned, also Jean-Baptiste Lully, Francois Couperin, Dietrich Buxtehude, Jean-Philippe Rameau, all composers worth knowing their music. So then we get to the classical era. So this is not the same as classical music. It is the classical era, and it is surprisingly short. It is a 75-year period. It is roughly 1750 to 1825. And there are a lot of composers from this time period. You have composers like Clementi, Czerny, Kuhlau, a lot of composers that still get played by a lot of instrumentalists. But as far as who has emerged long term, it's Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. I highly recommend the book. It's kind of a dense read, but it's called The Classical Style by Charles Rosen. I believe it was written in the 60s. Not at all easy, but he does a marvelous job of explaining why Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven stood out from all their contemporaries to become these major composers, and why their style really transcends that of basically everybody else. So in the classical era, you have an emphasis on structure. You have more three-part forms, such as ternary, which is ABA. But your dominant structures that come to be developed is what we call the sonata allegro form, and also the rondo form, which commonly exists in 5 parts or 7 parts. Just a little trivia, if you listen to the full version of Für Elise, that is a textbook 5-part rondo. It goes A, B, A, C, A. The piano is developed and emerges as a common instrument during this time. There's more emphasis on homophony instead of polyphony. So in other words, not so much independent rhythms between different voices. Instead, it's more importantly to have a dominant melody, a clear melody with a distinct accompaniment. One of the common things in all these time periods is that opera continues to kind of have its own timeline, its own evolution. This is the era where you have some major forms emerge. The string quartet, which was basically invented by Haydn. It came off of a Baroque form called a trio sonata, where he modified to feature only 2 violins, viola, cello, with no basso continuo, no harpsichord like you had in the Baroque time period. The Baroque era often featured what was called the basso continuo. Because a lot of the instruments were weak, you had basically what I would call a Baroque version of a lead sheet or a rhythm, and also a rhythm band. You have an instrument like a cello playing a written bass line, and you have a keyboardist like a harpsichordist or an organist who is improvising chords based off of a shortcut thing called figured bass. So it's a shortcut notation, and it's off of a single line staff. So that's something for probably another day. You also have the sonata in its formal definition with 3 or 4 movements, which basically gets adapted as the form of a string quartet, something called a string quartet, but also becomes the accepted definition of a symphony. So if you take the sonata allegro form and you give it to a single instrument in the classical era, it's called a sonata. If you give it to a string quartet, it's called a string quartet. If you give it to an orchestra, it's called a symphony. And if you give it to a featured instrument plus an orchestra, it's called a concerto. This structure dominates the classical era and goes way into the next era. And I just want to make a note, there is a pre-classical era. It goes from about 1730 to 1770. It features a lot of the sons of Bach, such as J.C., C.P.E., also composer Christoph Gluck and Luigi Boccherini. There's a lot of overlapping of periods around this time. So then the last era I'm going to discuss with any detail is the Romantic era, which is, I always tell people who say casually, I like classical music. I say, I bet you like Romantic music. So the Romantic era is 1825 to 1900, again, roughly. This is where we have an explosion of musical development and sophistication. And one of the things we also have is the infusion of dramatic elements. And the key event from this time period was the translation of Shakespeare into German and other languages. And that's why you have a whole lot of pieces based on Romeo and Juliet, on Hamlet, The Tempest, A Midsummer Night's Dream. But you also get things like, you get Franz Liszt composing adaptation of Faust. Instruments had major innovations, such as the concert grand piano. This is the era where brass instruments get valves. Orchestras get bigger. Pieces start to get longer. Improvisation at this point is no longer really valued as a commodity. The composer becomes more of the absolute rule of whom to follow. And you get increasing harmonic and polyphonic complexity. Not only does opera continue to develop, but thanks to Tchaikovsky, ballet has a tremendous evolution as a major orchestral form. And something that attracts a lot of ambitious composers. And your main composers, and this list could go on and on, but just main composers that are played a lot to this day: Schubert, Schumann, Chopin, Liszt, Richard Wagner, Tchaikovsky, Dvorak, Mendelssohn, Hector Berlioz, Johannes Brahms, and so on and so on. Just so many great composers from that time period. Now, I'm not going to talk about modern music in this episode, but I want to talk about two short transitions to modern music. And the first one is what I would call late Romanticism. Your main composers of this time period are Bruckner, Mahler, Richard Strauss, but I would also throw in Sergei Rachmaninoff kind of into this mix. So these are composers that composed well into the 20th century, but didn't write, actually with the exception of Richard Strauss, never wrote in what you would call a kind of a modern style or anything other than what was an extension of the Romantic era. And one thing that they had in common is they tended to use, especially the first three, used Richard Wagner as the starting point. And this is where you get what I call kitchen sink orchestration. Mahler's Second Symphony basically literally asks, if you translate it, to use as many strings as you can afford to hire. And you're also getting, instead of 3 French horns or 4 French horns, 10 French horns. Instead of 3 trumpets, you're getting 8 trumpets. Orchestras are starting to spill off the stage. You're also getting an increased demand to use chromaticism in your harmony, and tonality reaches basically its peak, its breaking point. And by the way, it's worth to note that Arnold Schoenberg began his career as a late Romantic composer before he completely changed a good portion of how music was composed. Now, one of the reactions to the late Romanticism is Impressionism. And so your 3 main composers are Claude Debussy, Maurice Ravel, and Erik Satie, and they were all French. And it is a direct reaction, again, to late Romanticism. There's an emphasis placed on orchestral color, on tone color. Also an emphasis on restraint, more use of extended harmony like 7ths, 9ths, even up to 13ths. Also, this is where the modes from the Renaissance era get reintroduced, mainly because Debussy was such a big fan. And so now we get all of these ecclesiastical modes, but we also get an exploration on things like all whole steps, what we call the whole tone mode. And there's more refinement in orchestration. If you study Ravel, you get orchestration that still holds up as something really spectacular. So that brings us to modern music, and I just want to say a few things about it before I end this episode today. So modern music is considered by most to be an era that we are still in since 1900. Now, I cannot do a summary of that because I just want to just give you this example. I want to take the years 1900 to 1940. It's a 40-year period. Okay, what can I say about the year 1900? There are no cars. I mean, hardly any. There might be 5 or 6. There's no radio. There's no television. There's the earliest versions of movies that nobody has seen except at world fairs. There are no airplanes. We do not know how to fly. Now, I want you to go to the year 1940, 40 years later. Cars are everywhere. Radio is everywhere. Television is in its infancy. Movies are not only everywhere, we've gone to nearly 4-hour epics that in Technicolor on like Gone with the Wind, and movies like The Wizard of Oz, Disney movies like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and Pinocchio. Not only can we fly, but we're flying at high speed and dropping bombs during World War I and World War II. And what happens to music during this time? It goes from tonal to dissonant and atonal to 12-tone. And then after World War II, you have about 20 years where you further deconstruct tonality into serialism, aleatoric music, avant-garde, the addition of synthesizers. And 1960s and 70s develops minimalism. And all of this just needs further discussion. It's just not something that I could cover in this. Now, I'll go ahead and say on the record here, in case anybody who listens to this podcast is a historian of influence, I don't think we're in the same era that we started in 1900. I think that era, you could cap it off just like you did with the classical and romantic era as a 75-year period. I think you can say it went from 1900 to 1975, and I think you should call it the innovative era because that reflects what happened during that time period. Because since about 1975, maybe you might want to say 1980, there hasn't been anything really new in what we call the classical world as far as compositional. We've had all of our changes have been in technology, but what has become really accepted since about 1980 is anything goes, eclecticism. It's fine to be neo-baroque, neo-romantic, neoclassical. I think a really good embodiment of this is someone like Carl Jenkins, who is what I would call a neo-baroque minimalist. Composers do not get ostracized for sounding too tonal or for sounding experimental. So really, we are in an eclectic era since 1975. So that's my thoughts. I am not a historian. I have no influence over future music history books. But let me know what you think about that. And let me know what you think about anything that I've said in this episode. You can tell me with your own words at speakpipe.com/musiciantoolkit or send me a message at davidlanemusic.com. That's going to wrap up today's episode. But I will be back with you again next week. Please share this episode if you've got any value out of it at all. I know that a lot of you probably knew just about all of this, but this may be fun, new information for somebody. So sharing it would be wonderful. So again, that's going to wrap up today's episode. I'll be back with you again next week. Until then, thank you so much for listening.